there are no moments that are impossible to transform. And there are no moments that are so ordinary that they can't be uplifted. And rather than seeing that as some kind of magical process, Hasidism begs for us to bring the human capacity for attunement, for resonance, and for presence to everything that we do.
Before diving into this fantastic book of yours, Laws of the Spirit, available at your local bookstore.
Stanford University Press and your local bookstore.
Nice. I'm curious. What other? This seems like a central subject that's been on your mind for some time, years, maybe even decades. Is there anything else that's up on that level of obsessing your mind that's been capturing your attention for so long?
You know, when I first went on the job market, it was funny. I would say things like, I'm a scholar of early Hasidism, or I think a lot about questions of Jewish mysticism. And I remember giving a research presentation on a Zoom interview, Skype interview. This was in the days of Skype interviews. And one of the faculty members on the search committee just had been silent mostly. And then he said, but what are the questions that keep you up at night? And I thought to myself, everything up until that point was kind of like clearing my throat. And the question is, what was really like the burning concerns that were not just field specific, but were questions about what does it mean to be a scholar of the humanities? What does it mean to be a human being in the world? Things like that. The quip about clearing your throat is something that this person actually heard from Irving Howe when he was giving a presentation. Not the nicest thing, but also a very applicable one. So that kind of forced me to scramble on my feet and to think about, well, what are the questions that keep me up at night? And that was actually a really fertile way of grappling with the implications of my academic work. And I realized there are kind of 4, maybe 5 questions that really, really concerned me. One of them, which we'll come back to, is the question of law and spirit, or ritual and mysticism, or action and intention, however we want to frame that book, which is something that, you're right, I've been thinking about not for a few years and not for a few decades, but really since I was like 17. Ever since I emerged from my training as a martial artist and met the spiritual worlds of Hasidism at that very fertile contact point when I was an older adolescent. So that's one, and we'll talk about it. Another is really the question of language in spiritual experience. How do words function as a part of mystical language? How do words function as part of that which can open up broader vistas of meaning? How can they expand the horizons of the spiritually possible? Can they connect us to God? Can they connect us to other people? Is language something that needs to be overcome and transcended? Are we in search of a God that is silent? If so, how so? Is it possible that we might give language to that silent God? So these were all things that I wrote about in my dissertation and were really, really important for me. I guess I still think about them quite a bit. Language hasn't become any less central in my life, and I think in a world in which the meaning of words is largely debased, and in which language is not only a rhetoric of violence, but also has been kind of evacuated of any moral responsibility by the way that we just throw words into what some call a digital republic of letters, and which to me seems like a crypt that holds useless statements that is much of our social media. Another question that I think a lot about is whether or not Hasidism ought to be considered a modern religious movement. And if so, which, I'm pretty convinced that it should be, because I often talk to medievalists, and they're like, no, you're not a medievalist. You're a scholar of Hasidism. That's modern. Then I go hang out with people in modern Jewish studies, and they're like, no, you're a medievalist. You study people that still believe in religion and modernism, and modernity is secularism, and secularity and secularization as some kind of an inevitable process. But I think there's something really interesting about considering Hasidism within the broad range of religious movements that are happening in the 18th century, and also considering it as a part of the philosophical developments of the multiple versions of Jewish modernity. there's not just one. There's one in North Africa. There's one in the Middle East. There's one in Eastern Europe. There's one in Western Europe. There's a different version that's happening in what becomes the American Republic. All of these are different Jewish stories. And Hasidism is by and large excluded from modern Jewish thought, which is Buber and Rosenzweig and maybe the 19th century Wissenschaft people, and of course Mendelssohn. Then the big debate is Spinoza, is he the last of the medievals, the first of the moderns? The Baal Shem Tov and his followers are totally excluded from that. So I've written a lot about that, and I still think a lot about that. Another question that kept me up at night more in decades past and less so now is something that feels very specific to the study of Hasidism until you start really getting to know the subject. And that is, we talk about Hasidic texts. But every Hasidic text, or at least the majority of Hasidic texts, started off not as a text. They started off as a moment of spiritual encounter between a teacher and a student, or between a rabbi and a community, and they're these oral addresses, or oral eitzot, oral counsels, that are given at a particular time and place, and then they crystallize like a snowflake into these books. And those books are what we call, as scholars of Hasidism, the primary sources, but they are most of the time written post facto, not during or before the actual Hasidic sermon. So that's one layer of transformation. They're transformed from Yiddish into Hebrew, which means that there's another significant difference. They are oftentimes written down by disciples rather than by the teacher himself. It's almost always a hymn. And then they're published from manuscripts as books. And I've never looked at a manuscript that looked exactly like a book. There's always some difference. And often those are substantive and quite significant differences. So I thought a lot about that in years past, and I still have a great interest in this. A bunch of years ago, I think when I was a graduate student, I read a paper that Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, and he wrote it in Yiddish when he was working as a Farsammler, as a collector of Hasidic ephemera, material culture, texts. And he said, look at all these amazing documents I have, either that were passed down in my family or I collected. And one of them was a Yiddish version of perhaps the greatest Hasidic book of the 20th century, the Sfat Emet, right? Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib, Alter of Ger. So this book, often translated as the language of truth, and in fact in Arthur Green's translation of the book, I think that's how he translates the title. There we have a book that seems like a sterling example of someone who wrote the book himself. It was there more or less ready when his sons went into his room after his death. Is it what he said? Probably not. We all change things as we're taking down notes, and sometimes he says, oh, I don't remember this, or I forgot that, or I'm writing it down b'kitzur nimratz, in haste and in brevity. And Heschel said, I bought a copy of this book from a chassid on the Lower East Side, I think it was, for $15, and it was in Yiddish. And he had a family tradition, I think, or a family connection to the author, and it was something that person had written down in Yiddish right after having heard it. And he said, look at the Hebrew version, look at the Yiddish version. The Yiddish version is so much longer, it's so much easier to understand. All of these scholars who are working only from the primary sources, again, the Hebrew version, need to realize that not only is this an echo of an original speech act that was given at a particular time and place, the texts themselves have been totally transformed. That was lost for a lot of years, and a scholar by the name of Daniel Reiser and I found that, and we actually wrote a book about it and published it together, and that was a lot of fun. And I guess the last question, in addition to the question of laws of the spirit that really keeps me up at night, and this is what I devote a lot of my time to these days, is the question of how religious traditions, mysticism in particular, can be helpful in terms of contemporary ethical, political, and spiritual problems. There are a lot of pressing issues, everything from civic discourse to the digital civilization that we live in, which present us with many problems. We think about the attention economy, and we think about the way that we are being reshaped by both corporations and devices. I think mysticism has a great deal to at, or perhaps to remind us of. But a lot of my work now is about ecology and questions of environmental ethics and how mysticism can be a powerful and disruptive force to teach us totally different ways about thinking about the natural world, experiencing the natural world, opening ourselves up and sensitizing ourselves to the natural world, and how the texts and the techniques, or perhaps we could call them ritual technologies of our tradition, can be core to that work. Can I add one more thing to what I was saying about manuscripts?
Please. Yes.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about my own experience also of having moved from a Jewish studies PhD program and for living and teaching and being trained in Israel for so many years, one of the really important things in my own spiritual journey was to take that training and to take that all those wonderful historical and philological and all those other kinds of gifts that I received in working with some truly magnificent teachers, to take that into a religious studies department where I am both allowed and forced to have conversations across religious disciplines has been so fantastic for my own growth and my own deepening as a scholar and as a human being. I remember talking to one of my colleagues about these questions of manuscripts, etc., and he's a scholar of Buddhism, and he just looks at me. He has one of these, like, he doesn't quite roll his eyes, but he looks at me and he says, Buddhist studies scholars have been thinking about this for hundreds of years, and Buddhist practitioners have been thinking about this for thousands of years. We, too, belong to a tradition where the original words, the ipsissima verba of the founder of our tradition, are lost to the margins of history, and we have it in Sanskrit and Pali and Tibetan and Chinese and Japanese and a host of other languages, and we have to kind of triangulate and understand. And so we've developed ways of thinking about this. And like so many things, I realized, this is a Jewish story, and it's one version of a story, but it's also a bigger story about the way in which words that are spoken by religious teachers have long afterlives, half-lives, lives as they enter into the Republic of Letters.
Yeah, it's truly a question which is not just a Jewish or Hasidic or even a religious question, but a human question.
Yeah. You have it also with Islam, with the Hadith,
Sure.
and how you develop these chains of tradition to understand what is and is not. And I often, when I'm trying to teach my students about philology, how do ideas change and how do ideas ride on the back of words, as one of my teachers once put it, we often look at things like whether it's the Declaration of Independence or Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and look at the different versions of it and realize that pretty much without fail, this is a way in which before everything was recorded, which has its virtues and its demerits, this is how ideas happened.
Yeah.
This is how ideas moved.
Totally. Just as I'm listening to this list of questions, and I noticed when we were speaking the other day how central questions are to your practice and to your inquiry. It seems to me that you're almost not looking for answers; you're looking for good questions. And there's a real like a delight and like how lucky to spend a life thinking about questions like these. I'm curious, how did you get to be in a position where you get to think about these questions full time in the way that you do?
Professionally or personally?
I mean, kind of both. I'm curious in the story that makes up the questioner that sits before us.
I think like a lot of things, whatever's happening now is rooted pretty deeply in what my youngest kid calls the days gone by of yesterday. I had the good fortune of having very good primary school teachers who consistently taught me that, in fact, questions, whether they were research questions or personal questions, were really what drive forward any kind of project. And I was thinking the other day about my second grade teacher, who was also my fourth grade teacher. And I think she taught us a lot of different wonderful things. But one of the things that we did in her class, Mrs. Young's, was writer's workshop. You have an idea, you sit down and talk about it, you write a draft, you sit with her, you talk about it, you go back, you write a better draft, you sit with her. Once she okays it, then you write it out again, then you illustrate it, and then you publish it. And I realized, well, like 30 years later, 35 years later, I'm still doing exactly the same thing. My parents were very good about leaving books all around the house and making sure that I constantly had reading material that didn't just confirm what I was seeing around me, but I think, as the educational philosophers, people like Rudim Sims Bishop and Emily Stiles have taught, books, especially for children, need to be mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. You need books in which you can see yourself and sort of have the opportunity to reflect on your own life and your own thinking and your own actions in the way that is appropriate for children. You also need the ability to be able to look into something totally different. And at the same time, you need books that open up possibilities for alternative ways of being in the world, and those are the sliding glass doors. And then pretty early on, I was also blessed with the good fortune of studying martial arts with an incredible set of teachers for whom martial arts was really a spiritual path with an external translation. And so the training was extremely rigorous and intense, but at the same time, we increasingly, over the years of our training, were taught everything that happens on the outside needs to be a reverberation of what's happening on the inside. And one of the things that I love so much about that was that after black belt training, which is this 6-month period of time, which is pretty intense, where everything we had done in the dojo, we then do in the mountains or in the middle of a forest or on an ice floe or in the middle of a really cold river, all these kinds of things, which I think also instilled in me and continue to instill in me a love of the outdoors. All of that ended with a little piece of fabric that you wrap around your waist called a black belt. And my teacher, Sensei Stewart, would always say, if you want a black belt, you can just go buy one. It's very simple. I'll sell you one. If you want to become one, it takes time. And the other thing is that in the style that I studied, the great transition in your life is to go from being a beginner, that's all the belts up until black belt, to being what in Japanese is called shodan, which means a student. So the big transformation is that you go from being a beginner, and it takes 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, 15 years, to becoming a student. And it's an orientation that's really about process rather than results. And I think I took that into academia, and I've been blessed to have had doors open in front of me, and I've been blessed to have continuously wonderful teachers that have helped to make it personally and professionally possible that I'm able to do the kind of work that I do. And I think some of the best elements of academic life are not to simply toss around very abstract questions that have no importance and are just kind of like semantics or nonce or whatever it's called, but really to imagine and rethink and turn it over and turn it over, and to re-envision the horizon of what might be. And you're never going to get there if you're looking at the old answers, and you're never going to get there if you're simply kind of only grappling for solutions. The fix-it mentality or the solutions mindset has wonderful implications. On the other hand, it has very terrible implications. We see this with children. Sometimes they want you to fix something. More often than not, they're not looking for solutions. They're looking for someone who is willing to sit with them. And, as I always told, the difference between a quest and a question is that questions have answers, and quests do not. And it's the revelation that happens along the way of the quest that we ought to be attuning ourselves to.
How did the quest bring you specifically to Chasidism as the area in which you were able to sink into with those lifelong questions?
when I went to college, I grew up in a secular family. Religion wasn't something that played an important role in either of my parents' lives. But I found myself drawn to spiritual questions and increasingly drawn to religious questions, questions that had not only their fundamental roots in the interior world, but also questions of tradition, questions of ritual, obligation, things that I was struggling to find a vocabulary for, but I kind of knew from the inside through not the pageantry, but the choreography of martial arts. So I took Hebrew as a foreign language because I needed it for my BA. And I walked into a class on Introduction to Jewish Studies or Jewish Culture, or Jewish Cultural History, taught by the late and much lamented David Beale, and who was at UC Davis, where I was studying. And one of the most amazing things happened, which was that although I had been studying history and really enjoying it, I hadn't felt something that felt like it was really beginning to ignite. And after 7 weeks, 8 weeks of this class of Introduction to Jewish Cultures, we had done Talmud, and we had done Bible, and we had done the medievals, and Spain, and all the greats. There was one class devoted to the religious life of Eastern Europe, and David had a particular interest in Hasidism, so he gave lots of breathing room to Hasidism. And I found, almost like a bolt of lightning, some kind of religious discourse that felt like it was something that I knew intuitively from my own experience. When the protean creator of Hasidism, or the one who is attributed with founding Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, describes the way that intentionality and action can work together, and that all moments can become transformative, uplifted, and ennobled through the work of the heart, not just particular rituals, but anything. I found myself electrified because that's exactly what my teacher in martial arts had taught me. Martial arts is one thing, but it's continuous with the rest of the world, and everything that you learn in the dojo, you also have to carry in everything else that you are doing. So I walked into David Beale's office and I said, "That was great, give me more reading." And I've come to understand even more so now that I'm on the other side of the fence, how rare that is that an undergraduate will ask for more reading, and even rarer that they will do it. And so David assigned me a bunch of books, and I read them. And then he taught me for 4 years. I studied with him on a pretty much weekly basis, learning the vocabulary, which at times felt frustrating and recondite, and also felt tremendously uplifting and exciting. And I broadened my understanding of Hasidism as an incredible fan of spiritual possibilities. And it was at that point that I decided, okay, this is what I want to spend the rest of my life studying. So I wrote an undergraduate thesis about it. And then he and I worked to try and figure out, where can one possibly do a PhD in Jewish studies that will allow me to pursue this not only as a kind of scholarly discipline, but a graduate program that allows me to explore it as a spiritual human being as well. And that's not something to be taken for granted in academic circles.
That actually leads right to the next question, which I wanted to ask, which feels like a rude question to ask if this was a purely academic interview, but thank God it's not, which is your spiritual journey alongside your academic interest in Chasidism. I'd love to hear about that story.
I think even if this were an academic interview, there wouldn't be anything rude about asking a question to the human being sitting in front of you. I think there's room, and increasingly so, for both academics and all of those involved in the academy, including students, graduate or undergraduate, to grapple with questions of faith and religion and meaning. A few years ago, a wonderful pair of researchers published a book called No Longer Invisible, which is about questions of faith in the academy. and on the front of it was a big picture of the Stanford Memorial Church. And I think their point was that there are openings now, not only in classes on religious studies, but classes of all different kinds of subjects in which questions of faith, together with questions of philosophy and literature and other kinds of humanistic disciplines, ought to be grappled with and taken seriously. In many respects, I think I'm not good at compartmentalization. I've never been drawn toward that as a way of being in the world. And while I think it's important to draw distinctions in between, let's say, constructive theological work and historical scholarship, I don't see those as two fundamentally separate activities. In the same way that in the Jewish tradition we have, on the one hand, halacha, which is a kind of ritual discourse with its own technical vocabulary and modes of reasoning. And then we have agadah, which is legend and theology and narrative and myth and all of these other things. These are not two hats that either separate people wear or people take one off and put the other on, but are rather elements of conversations that get foregrounded at one time or another and are always linked with each other, or always ought to be linked with one another. So my life as a religious person is part and parcel of my life as a scholar of Hasidism. So one of the things that I think animated, in the sense of allowed me to have the energy to do the kind of work that I was doing, was my own life as a person in the service of the divine, on the search for the divine, constantly yearning for greater proximity, and also thinking about what is it that God asks from us in every moment, and what kind of world are we meant to create through our engagement with tradition and with the people around us. I think one of the things that I have found so powerful about Hasidism is, on the one hand, there's a God whose presence is ultimate and omnipresence. Melo chol haaretz kvodo, that there is no place devoid of divinity and no action devoid of divinity. There's no part of the human life that is devoid of divinity. There's nothing that ought to be retreated from, either from the world or within oneself, that needs to be cut off or erased. And on the other hand, there is this real sense of a continuity in Chasidism with the medieval Kabbalistic idea of the mitzvot being given letzorach gavoa, that the commandments were given to fulfill a divine need. One of my favorite teachings on this comes from Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, someone who I had the great pleasure of spending a lot of years studying his works, who takes this Talmudic passage about walking in God's ways and following in God's footsteps. And the Talmud says, just as God visits the sick, so shall you visit the sick. Just as God buries the dead, so do we have an obligation to bury the dead. And the way that is phrased in the Talmudic structure is Mahu mevaker et hacholim, afata mevaker et hacholim. Just as you visit this, just as God visits the sick, so do you. And it has many different other virtues and actions that are tied together. And that's all a part of a sugya, or a unit of Talmudic discussion, that asks the question, how is it that we can follow in the footsteps of a fiery and all-consuming God, in the language of the book of Deuteronomy? And the answer there is by connecting to the attributes of the divine. And in Chasidism, following on the footsteps of the 16th century spiritual renaissance in Safed in northern Israel, Rabbi Dov Ber asks or interprets the question Ma hu rachum somewhat differently, and he understands this kind of clinical structure of ma'af, which means just as, so too. Idiomatically, he understands the word ma as in ma nishtana halayla hazeh, how is this night different from any other night? And so he asks, how is it that God visits the sick? As you visit the sick. How is it that God does these? by our good works, serving as God's hands and feet and the expression of God's heart in this world through the power of kindness, through the power of obligation to others. And I found questions like that to be truly determinate, dispositive in my own thinking. And this is not something that I left at the university when I closed my books and went home from the library, but in Hasidism I found a path of ritual and devotion, a path of ceremony and tradition, a way of raising a family, and at the same time, a kind of strongly animative moral philosophy that made tremendous claims on me as a human being in the world, vis-a-vis my different communities of responsibility, to the Jewish community, to the community that surrounds us, to the world itself, to the plants and the animals that I am, they're my companion species here on this planet. And so it was in that I found, I guess, the kind of spiritual underpinnings that someone like Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was so involved in interfaith dialogue and also interfaith action, had always seen.
This quest of yours of re-envisioning the very horizons of what's possible is something which is very alive in your engagement with academia itself. That's something which is very apparent. And that's a beautiful, beautiful drush, as opposed to reading just as God does X, so we should do X, but how can God do X by us doing X? That responsibility to be the divine presence in the lives that we're gifted.
Can I say one thing about academia?
Please.
A number of years ago, I stumbled upon an essay by Immanuel Kant called The Conflict of the Faculties. And it's an important essay for understanding the consolidation of power in German research universities. And in this essay, Kant really talks about the necessity of creating universities along the lines of factories, where everyone's going to become experts, and there are going to be different bodies of knowledge, and they're going to be specialists. And it's not exactly what becomes a kind of, capitalistic assembly line structure, but it's also not exactly not that. And when we think about the university as an agent of domestication rather than as an agent of education, and this is true of so many primary schools and high schools, and also in a certain sense yeshivot, or religious academies that are more interested with teaching hashkafa, a kind of predigested orientation to the world, rather than fostering a kind of vital, animating religious quest, which has anarchic developments within it, but at the same time also is constricted, or if not constricted, constrained by the sort of magnetic power of tradition. And I think that's one of the great lessons of the spiritual creativity of early Hasidism, is that the explosion of vitality that it brings into the world is not held back by its commitments to tradition, but rather channeled, kind of like when actors talk about the necessity of a score that allows for the channeling of inspiration. That's one of the ways that I think Hasidism treats ritual life. That's not always the case in the academy, where you can be really, 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 really good at one very, very specific thing, and that is seen as a good thing as opposed to a bad thing. And yet we are confronting questions and problems of meaning, of our moral obligation to the planet, of our moral obligation to the interconnected world on a political plane, but also on an existential plane. And these are not questions that can be solved through any single discipline. These are questions that require the broadest angle lens to be able to really come at them. And I go back to this phrase that you find in medieval Hebrew literature, the Chacham HaKolel, someone with an expansive mind whose wisdom brings them into many different spheres of knowledge as a dream I have for academic circles. And of course, that's not just multiple kinds of knowledge, but also multiple kinds of knowing. And in that sense, why should religious practitioners be pushed outside of academic circles and only texts are privileged, or if religious practitioners brought in, it's only as subjects to be analyzed, as perhaps they might also be contributors to the knowledge formation.
It seems like a real central line in that questioning of yours has been around this framework of ritual, of embodied activity that carries with it the ethical and perhaps even the ontological weight of the tradition that it's bringing forth. I'm curious, before asking about your current work, fantastic work on ritual, and where it sits and stands with you today, I'm curious, as a child, did you have a relationship with ritual? You mentioned so far the martial arts, and there's a sense where that really has been formative in your journey. But was there exposure to some of the ritual and culture around what you studied, or was it entirely foreign to you as you engaged with it for the first time in academia?
You know, I think one of the great developments in ritual studies over the past 20 or 25 years has been the important reminder, corrective, that ritual isn't always food. It's not a sometimes food. If you look for ritual only as something that has been inherited from a religious tradition, then no, it was all foreign to me. If you understand the way that human beings order and make sense of their lives as something in which ritual is actually indispensable, you know, going to Roy Rappapart's definition of ritual as something that is often repeated and whose meaning is not entirely encoded by the practitioner. Did I have those? Yeah, every Sunday morning, as we say in Hebrew, Yahareg ve'al Yahavor, my family went out for breakfast. This was like something that you would lay down your life for. And we also rode our bikes many miles to go do so. And I think there were different times in my life when I enjoyed that more and I enjoyed that less. But there was a kind of stability that came along with that. And while we had rather few things that would be described as rituals in a constricted sense, we had many things that I think gave my life pylons of recognizability. And I think that was only further underscored by the fact that in martial arts, and in karate, and Shotokan karate, the kind that I practiced for so many years and still carry with me, you know, we learned, I don't remember the number, 20 or 25 katas, sets of motions that had been passed down and slightly modified. They were both unchanging and changing at the same time. And we would spend decades learning those same things, while at the same time, one of the things that my teacher also emphasized was everything stays the same and nothing stays the same. And if you haven't made the kata your own, you've done nothing. But if you change it, you've transformed it in ways that are unrecognizable. So how do you hold those two things together? So what in Jewish vocabulary might be described as the tension in between kavanah, intentionality, spontaneity, how we guide the flow of affect and attention in our work, together with keva, a kind of organizing structure in which there's a right way to do something, and then there's a less right way of doing things. And there are ritual dimensions to it. This is something that has, for me, come into relief within the Jewish context as deeply rooted in the martial arts practice of my youth. Yeah, Stuart, my teacher, Sensei Stuart, would always say, every time you do the same kata, you're fighting a different opponent. And then I remember reading in the writings of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, who said, never pray the same way twice. you can never pray the same way twice, in fact. Why? Because you'll have different distractions and because you're a different person. So although the liturgy is there as a kind of sulam, as a kind of ladder that you can work with, like a climbing wall that you're making a route out of, it's always different. You're different. The world is different. The birds are different. The light is different. It's never the same. Externally, it looks entirely, mostly the same.
But the river is never the same, and we're never the same.
The river is never the same, and we are never the same. And all of a sudden, when you start realizing that, like, I've taught the same classes at Stanford many times, they're never the same.
Sure.
You have the same conversations with people about the same subjects. They're never the same. And I think this is where, like the great watchword of Hasidism, as I understand it, is the push and demand toward presence. And that's presence in ritual, that's presence in one's actions in the world, and that's presence in every encounter that one has.
There's two words that have been bubbling through this conversation a lot: Chasidism and ritual. And I'd like to step into those words proper, because I think that either people know little about those words and could help from a bit of expansion, or they know a lot about those words and could help from a reframing of what they think those words are. And I genuinely think, and I have no doubt you agree, that this conversation, although it's couched in the particularity of Hasidism, is a human conversation, is a global conversation, perhaps even beyond the human. And I think there's such an importance of speaking from within the particularity which we are, and seeing what the wisdom therein might be, and how that wisdom might be turned to applied wisdom that people can really bring into their lives. So let's dive into the particularity with a vision to where that may take anyone who's joining us. Would you care to tell us, ever so briefly, what is Chasidism? And then we'll step on to what is ritual, and perhaps what is ritual not, so that we can clear some space for new thinking about these words, for new kavanot, for new intention around these words.
Hasidism, like ritual, is a lot of things to a lot of people. For a lot of people, it's men with black hats or furry hats, depending on what day of the week, and long side locks and long coats. Women with shaved heads whose voices are not taken seriously. It's the stories of Martin Buber, a kind of romanticized vision that is, if not as schmaltzy as Fiddler on the Roof, it's almost there. It's everything that is wrong and backwards with mystical religion, and at the same time, for others, it is the great hope of Jewish spirituality in the modern period. And clearing away some of those preconceptions, misconceptions, different readings of Hasidism, all of which carry with them kernels of truth, is part of the joy and the complexity in working in a field in which there is so much that has been written and so much that is still being written. Hasidism, I think, can rightly be described as a movement of Jewish mystical renewal that moves out of the teachings of Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov, or the Master of the Good Name, at some point in the early to mid-18th century. It happens in Subcarpathian Eastern Europe, and by the early decades of the 19th century is an extraordinarily powerful and well-attested force throughout Eastern Europe. It's Jewish in the fact that it concerns Jews, but it's mystical in the sense that many of the lessons of the Baal Shem Tov on the presence of God and on the power of ritual or on the sociology of religious experience or whatever it might be, the necessity of joy, the imperative to presence, all of these things When you stop speaking about them in Hebrew and you do the good work of translating them into other languages, they become totally recognizable to someone who has studied Meister Eckhart or Julian of Norwich, or who has studied even Arabi, or who has studied any other numbers of mystical traditions from really across the world. And renewal in the sense that rather than a revolution that seeks to cut off what comes before, it's an attempt to, perhaps like what Nietzsche says, the transvaluation. It's an attempt to provide new meaning to the structures of Jewish life. So is it radical? Sure. It's deeply radical. Radical in the sense of the botanical sense of something that sends out, shoots in many directions, and drills down deeply into the heart of the soil. And it is a kind of reorientation toward the meaning of religious life, in which values like joy, delight, a kind of spiritual optimism, a commitment to prayer, a belief in the power of God's presence in all places and in all moments, is coupled with the grand story that it inherits from Lurianic Kabbalah, from the Kabbalah of the 16th century, or one of the Kabbalahs of the 16th century, that the world is broken and it needs our work to heal it. Or if not to heal it, to mend it and to set it right and to do our part in that story. Again, to go back to the idea that human beings are here for a purpose, and that we, like the birds and all the others, have a part to play in that cosmic unfolding. But one of the other great stories of the 16th century is not just the rupture of the breaking of the vessels that you find in Lurianic Kabbalah, but it's the story that you find in Moshe Cordovero, Luria's teacher, about the connectivity and the oneness of being. And in some sense, that's where the Baal Shem Tov really leans. We don't know much about the life of the Baal Shem Tov that doesn't come down to us in legends. We have a couple of documents here and there which are really interesting, and in which there are some articulations of what we would call practice and ritual. But he's quoted hundreds of times in the works of his disciples, or in the people that knew him, or either knew the people who knew him. And that's the kind of reservoir, the repository of teachings that we have in his name. One of his disciples, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, someone that I wrote my doctorate about, interestingly enough, seems only to have met the Baal Shem Tov twice, but I don't think it mattered. He was the kind of person that ignited you by the power of his presence, and then this kind of religious sensibility that drips off him in a way that really exceeds the cognitive. Wasn't the kind of person you had to go sit with for 10 years in order to get something from. Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich was someone who, rather than going from town to town, the Baal Shem Tov also had a stationary job. He was a resident Kabbalist and healer. But the Maggid seems to have been a little bit more of an organizational thinker, and he brought people together, or they came to him. And those people then went out, usually to the places from whence they came, and spread the teachings of Hasidism, which again at that point were far from a kind of crystallized or codified doctrine, but rather a marshy landscape of possibilities, all united by common threads. And it really spreads like wildfire in Eastern Europe, such that by the death of the disciples of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich in the years between the 1790s and the early 1810s, Hasidism is accounted all over Eastern Europe, and by the mid-19th century is, if not the dominant force, certainly among the most dominant political and religious forces in Eastern Europe. Should we go on to ritual, or do we want to talk more about the specificity of Hasidism? Should we talk about the name?
Please, yeah.
Hasidism is a name that's given to the Hasidim by their opponents, but used to great effect. Chasidim, in the language of Lithuania and Yiddish, comes out as Chasidim, or those who are suspect of external piety at the expense of ritual observance. But it's a word that they also use for themselves right after that, because Chasidut is a great Jewish story. Chasidut just being the the noun of what could be translated as piety, and could also be translated as devotion, in the sense of giving, in the sense of commitment. And I've always been drawn to that definition. I think that's one of the ways of understanding Hasidism that I received from my teachers, which is that it's not only about punctiliousness in the way that one observes the commandments in that sense of pietism, but kind of in the sense of German pietism, which is also happening in the 18th century in Protestant circles, about a return to the body and about the knowing of God that happens within the soul. And it's not just text and it's not just externality, but a deep turn inward that then radiates outward. So I like to think of Hasidism as the story of Jewish devotion that has an ancient version in the time of the Mishnah. It has medieval connotations in the 12th and 13th century in the Rhineland pietists, and then appears again in the writings or the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, and then the writings of early Hasidism. And in doing so, I think they're connecting themselves to a long tradition of Jewish mystical thinkers and Jewish religious personalities who go beyond the letter of the law, not because they worship the law itself, but because they are drawn closer and closer by that yearning for intimacy with the divine.
What a beautiful description. I'm wanting to ask, what is the role that law plays in Hasidism and the conflict there, but I'm going to hold off that question with some patience and ask first, what is ritual? And it might be helpful to disclaim some of what people think when they hear that word.
So to begin by disowning the things that it's not, like all discussions of mysticism, what is mysticism? I don't know, but I know what it's not. It's not this and it's not that. It's not what those other people do. Ritual is a thorny and complicated subject. I guess you could say that there are like three main schools of ritual, or the study of ritual, and the way that people have tried to make sense of this thing that human beings do, which is repeated actions that seem to have some bigger aim that they are both moving toward intentionally and also not intentionally. There was a pretty significant body of scholarship that understood ritual as thoughtless action. Just ritual. We could call those the just ritualists. It's external, it's meaningless. I think it's not an accident that those scholars came from religious traditions themselves that put less emphasis on the choreography of religious life and more interest on text or philosophy or interiority, whatever. And I think there was a pretty big misunderstanding that for so many religious people across the world, those physical actions are not simply thoughtless things that, why do you do it? I don't know, my parents did it, I do it, whatever. Tradition, right? To go back to Fiddler on the Roof. There was a kind of dismissal of that, such that a few years ago, a prominent scholar of religious studies wrote a pretty fiery paper where he said, why are we studying religion and religious people as if they were just disembodied heads? And we take into account no one's body or their placement or their actions or all sorts of other ways of thinking. And I think that was an important corrective. Some important religious things are found in books. Some. There are a lot of others that are found in many different other ways of being. Then there was a kind of approach to ritual, which was, I think, perhaps most well attested in like the anthropology of religion, but not only, where religious traditions were observed, and it was up to the scholar to make sense of them and to interpret them. And there were some people within religious traditions who might be doing that, but it was up to the scholar to try and understand what people were doing. And at the same time, every ritual is seen as some kind of a symbolic gesture. Why am I doing this? because it links up to the great myths of my people in this way, and everything was about the symbols to which the rituals point. And that's not to say that ritual doesn't have symbolic power. Symbol is key to the kind of discourse that religion trucks in. On the other hand, that kind of notion of the grand narratives was quite alien to many ritual practitioners. Why are you doing this? It doesn't have to be, I don't know, I don't think about it. And it doesn't have to be, well, you see, it links up to this grand passage or this grand idea that I'm trying to hearken back to. There are other answers for why people do ritual. And I've come to really find another third way of thinking about ritual is very fertile. And that is that rituals actually do something. That doesn't mean that I'm party to the metaphysical claims. The Kabbalists claim that ritual moves the divine and causes the flow of divine vitality into this world. I don't know, maybe. I don't have access to those like plumbing maps of the divine superstructures. But when Hasidic sources, when Kabbalistic sources, when mystical sources, and not just Jewish ones, talk about the power of ritual to provide spiritual uplift, and they do that in different ways in different traditions, or an influx of divine energy into the soul of the worshiper in a kind of affective, emotional moment, those are claims that I take very seriously. So in some ways, I think about ritual as perhaps triggering neurocognitive events. Who knows? We're only beginning to understand the way that happens. But more philosophically and linked to that, I think about ritual as a way in which people think. So here, the work of Kevin Schilbrack, my own colleague at Stanford, Tanya Luhrmann, who work on very different religious traditions but are party to these same conversations, have really pushed for a vision of ritual as a mode of human thought. I don't just have an idea and then I'm like, how am I going to figure out a ritual that will inscribe or I can squish this into? Sometimes people think through acting. Artists tell us that they don't know what a painting will be until they're done. Some have the vision, I see the angel in the rock, I cut until I said it's free. For many, it's not so. I talk to my friends who are authors, fiction authors, and most of them say, I have no idea how this story is going to turn out. There's an active discovery that comes along with writing, and writing is one of those rituals that has many para-rituals, right? My cup of coffee goes here. I'm one of these funny people that was caught in between generations. So while I write now on a computer, I write with a pencil in my hand because that's part of my thought. My thought includes that thing that is a pencil that's also a part of my mind. And prayer is not just something that happens within the heart, but prayer is something that happens with the body. We get up, we sit down, we move, we connect to other people. In other religious traditions and in Judaism also, we dance prayers. We move prayers. We sing prayers. The resonance within the human body is key to that work. And I think it's not an accident that in Chasidism you have an emphasis both in dance and in vocalized prayer. For some it's shouting, for others it's song, but for all there's an attentiveness to the spoken word precisely because of the way that it draws body and heart or soul together. So in some ways, rather than having an idea and then figuring out a ritual, or having an idea and then figuring out a ritual that can become its symbolic referent, it's the opposite. We do a ritual, and that, in the words of Adam Seligman, who he and his co-authors wrote this great book called what's it called? The Uses of Ritual, Ritual and Its Limits, something like that. It's one of these books that I never look at the cover because I'm too busy reading it over and over again. So Adam Seligman and his co-authors in this book, which drew together a bunch of different kinds of scholars, I think there are 4 of them, talk about the power of ritual to allow the mind space to wander and to wonder. And it guides us and allows us to do these things. And in doing so, it opens up new ways of thinking, which then get translated into new ideas, and those ideas come through ritual. And so the question of ritual and innovation is not one of a false polarity in between the two, but ritual is where innovation happens. It's where, in what we would say in Hebrew, the chadshut, the kind of newness and freshness of religious life, really comes to the fore.
There's a common Talmudic phrase that the divine precedes the infliction with the healing. And I feel like in conversation we've hinted towards where the solution might be before we've asked the question. And the question might be, and this is a question which is relevant to Chasidism and to mysticism in general and to religious life and human life in general and beyond. There seems to be, and scholars of Chasidism grapple with this question quite seriously, some sort of tension and conflict between the rigid, regimented, channeled life that religion prescribes, and the fervor, the ecstasy, the exuberance, this overflowing life, the explosion that you called it, that mysticism in general and Hasidic mysticism in particular represents. And those two have, at least in academic discussions, been seen as great objects of tension one with the other. In your book, you suggest that that's a misunderstanding of Chasidism. And I would love to hear why, both on the historical context and also in a contemporary sense for those of us that are grappling with our own moral, religious, ethical, political obligations and the force, the vitality, the energy, the drive behind those moral decisions and choices when those things seem to be difficult to reconcile. How are those being reconciled in Chasidism? Do they need to be reconciled? And what might that mean for us today, grappling with similar tensions?
There's a pretty well-ingrained tension in a lot of Western thought between law and spirit, which of course goes back to early Christianity. It has its parallels in Rabbinic Judaism also, and of course early Christianity and then Catholicism and then Protestantism in a different way have all sought to understand their own way of thinking about, or to advance their own way of thinking about ritual and law and obligation, and in those traditions, unbridled spirituality or spiritualism is seen as problematic in its own ways. But I think one of the unfortunate elements of that has been in the study of Jewish mysticism, in Jewish studies in general, which inherited a lot from Christian Hebraicism. There's kind of a tacit assumption about Jewish mysticism in which there's a tension between law and spirit in ways that in the scholarship on Christianity and in Christian denominational life, there isn't even a tension. It's like we took only that one framing and took none of the solutions. Because if you look at like medieval Christianity, gosh, the ritual life of it is so, what Catherine Bell would say, the thickness of it, the high ritual density is incredible. If you've ever been to a mass, even in the contemporary world, it's a movement of heart and body and imbibing and all of these things that are so transformative. right? Like, that's the whole thing. And so, like, scholars of Jewish studies kind of got fixated on this one polarity that if you're committed to the Spirit, you can't be committed to the law. And so then how do the Kabbalists work as legal scholars? Oh, they were good at compartmentalizing and this and that. And so a lot of the scholarship trying to figure out how does it work together. And then there were some really good advances, but then it all falls short when it comes to the study of Hasidism. The study of Hasidism as an academic field and the importance of Hasidism in modern non-Hasidic religious life for those who live outside of the cloistered world of modern Hasidic communities, the 5 or 6% of the Jewish population who live there, not them, but the others, really owes a debt of gratitude to some early figures, Martin Buber, whose writings are quite well-renowned, and Gershom Scholem, who is arguably a more central figure to the study of Jewish mysticism, but arguably less well-known in popular circles, although in the study of religion, in the study of mysticism, more generally, he's a very important figure. They disagreed pretty vehemently over a whole lot of things about Hasidism. For Buber, it was all this worldly and life-affirming. For Scholem, it was all world-denying, and it's about interiority at the expense of the exterior. For Buber, the tales, the lively narratives and stories about Hasidic thinkers or told by Hasidic thinkers, that's where the real folk wisdom, not in a negative sense, but in a powerful sense, really comes to the table. And for Scholem, it was all about the fairly recondite and fairly complicated theological material. And they really had bitter conflicts over this, although it was kind of one-sided. Buber said what he wanted to say, and then Scholem attacked him. And Buber's like, well, I never claimed to be these things. And Scholem was like, oh, well, you're still not an academic. And Buber was like, I never claimed to be. At least in his study of Hasidism. He was obviously a great scholar. But one thing that they really agreed on was that Hasidism was this explosion of what then becomes called by them and by their students of a kind of spiritual anarchism, that it pushes against the nomos, it pushes against the law, and it by its very nature is seeking to break free. None of them thought that the early Hasidic masters were hidden heretics, but there's a line in one of Scholem's students in which she says they don't have either the awareness or the courage to follow their own convictions. They fall back into the law, either because they couldn't break free or they didn't want to break free, but really they were straining against it. And Buber says the same thing about Hasidism and really about religion more generally. You said the strictures of religion just a few minutes ago. Buber famously divides between religion as an institutional thing and religiosity as the kind of spontaneity that he sees in figures like Jesus or in the figures like the Baal Shem Tov, these great spiritual teachers who come to bring something new to the table of world thought. And so for Buber, religiosity is something to be striven for, and religion is something to be avoided. And the shadow of that cast over Hasidism was really long. And then there's been a new wave of scholarship that's tried to understand, well, they weren't anti-religious, so how do we think about that? And I had 2 conversations with colleagues that were really informative for me. One, I had a conversation with Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill, who is a great scholar of many different religious traditions, Judaism included. And he said, I'm going to write a book about Hasidism and halacha, Jewish law. And he said, that's a dumb idea. They didn't believe in halacha. They believed in the mitzvot. They believed in the commandments. And I tried to figure out, what is he trying to tell me here? And it actually was really eye-opening because the word halacha, or law, which is not really a good translation of that word, let's call it the life path of the particulars, the modus vivendi of the way that we are in the world, those particulars don't really factor into early Hasidic homilies or sermons. But you can't read one of those without encountering the power of the commandments as the anchors of religious life. And I suddenly realized, the story that I'm trying to tell is not just about how did they, do ritual slaughter, and how did they rearrange this, or how did they rearrange that? But really about what is the meaning of religious action in the consciousness and cultural mind of early Hasidism, which changes in different times, but in the early period, it was the one that I was particularly interested in, not only because I think some of the most interesting material is found there, but because that's where Scholem and Buber really made their arguments. And Scholem has a line in the Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which is a book that is truly an incredible tour de force of erudition and insight, where he says that it's a wonder, it's a miracle that they stayed within the Orthodox establishment, within Rabbinism. And I wasn't convinced. I don't think it was a miracle. So then I had a conversation with my friend Eli Stern, who teaches at Yale, and I was telling him about some of the things I was thinking about, and he says, have you ever thought about ritual? Have you ever thought about another way of looking at this kind of discourse? And that sent me down a totally different way of thinking, which is not about they were religiously observant, they weren't religiously observant, oh, look, I can prove that they wore these kind of ritual clothes and they were actually more religious than the other people in like the sense of being frum, like in the sense of being not only classically observant, but like canonically so. And I realized that felt like a really boring argument that really missed the boat. What they were trying to argue for, at least as I understood it in early Hasidic sources, was that the life of Jewish observance is actually about something. And it's about a very profound story that has cosmic and personal, experiential, existential implications. And that because of that, this tension in between external observance of these commanded structures and a fealty to that and a commitment to spontaneity in worship, there's no tension in between those. And of course, there is some attempt to figure out, well, do you always follow the dictates of tradition? No, but like since Gadamer and the great philosophers of the 20th century, no one in religious studies, at least as I read them, has been thinking about tradition as this ossified thing that just exists in a vacuum. Tradition is constantly being remade through the good work of reinterpretation. So again, that's exactly what they're talking about. And if we take that angle, then so much more of the data that you find in Hasidic circles makes sense. It's a paradigm that I hope can hold the totality of early Hasidic thinking.
There's something really delightful, both in being able to receive the thought and the wisdom that you've been able to collect around these questions, and also to hear the journey of how they came to unfold, and the friends and colleagues and teachers along the way that help you unfold those ideas. And this reframing away from halacha, away from law, away from even thinking about the centrality of these patterns of living towards the mitzvah, towards a moment of connection, perhaps, as informed by ritual studies, and also the way that Chasidism sheds light on ritual studies. And certainly the scholarship which placed the two in opposition in early Chasidism was lacking some of that insight, which you've now, with good luck and good friends, stumbled upon. And good thinking, I'd say also. But before stepping into what that insight is and how it manifests in Hasidic life, and what that might mean for us, I want to stillman that question for a second of that tension between the spirit and the law. I know a lot of people might be thinking to themselves, people that have moments of grand inspiration, whether that's through art or music or love or psychedelics or dance, moments of expansion where they felt so much larger than any prior conception of self. What we might call a taste of a mystical encounter, a mystical experience. The attempt to then integrate that experience, that expansive experience, into daily practice, family obligations, professional obligations, that transition can feel torturous for people. is your contention that that transition is not something that the early Hasidic thinkers are struggling with because they conceptualize things differently, or is that a real tension that they are finding solutions to? I just want to nail down on that sort of human struggle between those, the largeness of the human spirit that can be so tone open in extraordinary moments versus the what feels like the mundanity of everyday quotidian life in this world.
Those times or attempts at transition are always hard. And I think one of the profound lessons that Hasidism really offers is another way of thinking about what in other circles might be considered a kind of dark night of the soul, where you have something very powerful. And the dark night of the soul is not just the absence of that connection with God, but it's the absence that comes after that moment of intimacy. When we read the Song of Songs, the end of the Song of Songs is not the consummation of the story. The moment of closest connection happens within the first few chapters. It's at the end of chapter 3, I think, where the curtain kind of fades to black. And then again in the 4th chapter, the lover and the beloved are still looking for one another. And that kind of quest is powerful and animating and also destabilizing, frightening. So you can have one version of that, which is that the almost like mind-blowing power that one has experienced is very hard to plug back into an ordinary grid. And in early Hasidism, they talk about that through the story of the children of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, who, according to one place in the Hebrew Bible, are punished because they offered a strange and uncommanded fire. The version that you find almost always in Hasidic sources is not that version. They talk about the fact that they die because they got too close to God. And they talk about moments of expansiveness, like the rapture of the deep, or a kind of almost like an Icarus moment, in which you get too close and you're singed, or even consumed. And they're aware of that. But they're also aware of something which is like that, but not like that, which is that when the Baal Shem Tov describes what it means to go into the mikveh, into the ritual bath, he talks about it as a kind of rebirth, of becoming a new being. And so the collapse in and the rebirth of one's way of thinking or one's way of being is definitely a part of what they are striving for. On the other hand, those moments of expansiveness are by necessity, both because we are human beings and because we're embedded, entangled into this world, require us to be able to moderate that, mediate that, titrate it, however you want to describe it. So in Hasidic lexicon, that's the ratzo v'shov, this growing close to the divine and then retreating from it. Sometimes it's called katnut hamochin, the constricted or small focused mind, as opposed to the expansive galut hamochin of those mystical encounters. But often it's described as a kind of necessary dynamic. Tanug ta'amidi eno ta'anug, that eternal or constant pleasure is no pleasure at all, which is something that comes to them by way of the medievals, but really is an ancient idea in the classics. Like the first 3 bites of ice cream are the best, and then after that it becomes routinized. So in Hasidic circles, there's a understanding that the vacillations or the kind of peregrinations, the moving back and forth of religious life, are actually key to the delight and the quest. On the other hand, there's another element of that, which is that you can't live in that place forever. And coming down from the mountain, as it's described in many religious traditions, or coming off of those vistas of spiritual attunement, are seen not as a concession, but as a translation. And we live our lives within this continuum of intensity. We have the 6 days of the week, and we have the Sabbath, which is this moment of connectivity. But the Sfat Emet, a 19th, 20th century Hasidic thinker, says, what does it mean, lishmor et Shabbat, to keep the Sabbath? It means to hold on to the inside of the Sabbath for the days that post-date it. It means to hold on to it, like in the book of Genesis. We actually just read this. V'aviv shamar et hadavar, that Joseph's father holds on to that testimony and doesn't say it. So we hold on to things, and we keep them with us like a candle that allows us to go into the week. And so the Sabbath is not seen as the culmination, but the center point. There's the 3 days preceding it where you're engaged in the good work of preparation, and then those 3 moments after. So I think in perhaps even the majority of Hasidic sources, it's not about staying in that one moment of illuminated consciousness, but rather figuring out all the different ways that that kind of passion can be translated into our ordinary lives, which is conversations, which conversations like this are transformative and ennobling. At least they are for me. But I also have to go hang out with people at the bank, and I have to talk to bus drivers, and I have to be that person where other people need things from me. And I can transform that by bringing a little bit of the candle of the mystical into it. And in doing so, I'm reminded of what Martin Buber says, that Chasidism's great lesson, or one of Chasidism's great lesson, is that the world is not divided between the holy and the secular, or the holy and the mundane, but the holy and the not yet holy, the not yet sacred. And that the great work of Hasidism is then to hallow the ordinary. Of the 2 teachings that are quoted most often in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, in the writing of one of his closest disciples, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, they're both quoted dozens of times in his writings. Both of them have to do with sanctifying the ordinary. One is the famous story of Enoch the cobbler, who stitches together heaven and earth every time he brings his needle and unites the fabrics, which becomes a way for the Baal Shem Tov of talking about the way that we create lives of meaning through our ordinary actions when they are undertaken with intention, and by overcoming the tension between our outer and our inner, we stitch those things together. And the other, which he then appends to or connects to a verse from Ecclesiastes, which seems to go in the exact opposite direction, and maybe we can speak about that at some point. But the other is this Talmudic passage, which is kind of curious. It's in the 3rd chapter of Ta'anit, which is a section of the Talmud which deals with droughts, and also how human society functions when things are falling apart. The 3rd chapter of that is about charismatic miracle workers and weird people, one of my favorites. And these 2 rabbis that go into a town, and they go into a market, and one asks the other, is anyone here worthy of the world to come? And one of them says, yeah, those 2 jesters, Hane Trei Badche, these 2 merrymakers. And that's pretty much the end of the story. And not that many people talk about it in the history of Jewish thought, but somehow for the Baal Shem Tov, it's quoted dozens and dozens of times. And so he says, how is this the case? And rather than reading this one against the grain, I think he pushes it forward in exactly the direction it wants to go, which is that these merrymakers are agents of the divine because they bring connectivity to human society. And they realize that the pathways to the divine lead through the pathways of the people in front of them, and that you can only reach the divine through the heart of the human being that you are enacting with at that particular moment. And so they achieve the world to come, not in spite of the fact that they are jokesters, but because they bring joy to the people around them. And that's not to say that there's not a time for sadness. That's not to say that there's not a time for deep inner work, which is very hard. It's not a time not to say that there's not a time to mourn, but it is to say that just as law and spirit are not a false false, they're not necessarily dualistic, and in fact they can be co-constructive. So rather than looking at them as a kind of false polarity, for the Baal Shem Tov, I think grief and joy can actually coexist. And one shuttles back and forth between them, but there's room for both within the human heart. And I think that's the great lesson of this other teaching, which is that one of the things that he says there in all the different versions of the teachings is that this is not something they did sometimes. It's something that they do all the time. They do it when they're doing business. They do it when they move here, when they go there. This is the totality of their existence, is reinforcing the bonds of human connectivity and making sure that happens not at the expense of others, but rather that our mystical lives deeply play out in the social plane. And if there is a dichotomy in between them, you kind of miss the boat. This is how in Hasidism they often read Elijah's castigation of the people of Israel at the moment in which they're offering all these idols to Baal, the false god. And he says, how long will you dance back and forth between these two different paths or these two different twigs? And so in Hasidism, the way that that's sometimes interpreted is, if you think that your moral life and your this worldly life and your mystical life and your spiritual life are incompatible, it's idolatrous. And so it's the seeking of that kind of integration that you really find in Hasidic circles. And that's not to say that it's not hard, but it is to say that what we are constantly looking for are conduits through which that kind of mystical vitality that we cultivate in those moments of, whether it's contemplation or awestruck experiences of nature, or substances that expand the possibility of human thought, any other number of things. The integration stations that follow those are no less meaningful and no less remarkable, even though they might be ordinary.
You're giving articulation to a really beautiful way of rethinking these supposed dichotomies and setting out the program that Chasidism gives us with a very rich feeling of the textuality and the playfulness by which they come to these new expanded and envisioned horizons. I want to be a bit more persistent and ask how does ritual, how do actions do that work of stitching together heaven and earth, of inside and outside? Because to me, doing the activity, doing the action, doing the ritual can feel very dull and lifeless and boring and empty. And it's hard for me to see where that divinity, where the expansiveness, where the love is present once it's being translated into action. So how both conceptually but also practically, how does one do that in their own life?
There's a line in the Talmud, reading the verse that insists that the Torah is not empty, where the Talmud says, and if it is empty, it's because of you. And there's something, I think, both very honest about the necessity of saying, none of us can bring absolute presence to everything. And sometimes ritual then can actually provide a kind of grammar for how in those moments where we feel like we are either searching for words or also, if we're not on the peaks of the mountains, we're actually deep in the valleys of frustration, the choreography can be very helpful. But it's certainly never the case that every one of those becomes illuminated, at least not in my life. I've met people for whom I rather suspect through years and decades of constant work, the gap between those has become very small. But we're all human beings. And I think the admission of that is fine. On the other hand, another hand, third hand, fourth hand, thinking like an octopus here, the possibility that ritual offers is not only does it provide us with a framework so that sometimes it can be meaningful, it is a structure of devotion and a structure of a kind of life orientation in which are they goalposts? Maybe. I like to think of them like cairns along the trail, little piles of rocks that help reorient you and remind you of where you ought to be going. No one has handed me a spiritual GPS where I just have to follow what it says on the app. But one of my teachers, Reb Zalman Schechter Shalomi, used to say that everyone has a maze in between them and God. And
Was he punning on your last name?
I don't think so, because he told this to a lot of people. Maybe I have a bigger maze. Everyone has a labyrinth in between them and the divine. Maybe that's a better one, because labyrinths sometimes shift. That's what makes them fun. And the labyrinth that sits in between us and God is unique to each person, but it's something that is endemic or perennial, perpetual. It's always the case. The tzaddikim, the righteous people, the great spiritual souls, are the ones who tell you where they hit their dead ends. And I think, in a certain sense, to frame that in the positive, it means that they're also the people who are willing to share a kind of afterglow of their own religious lives. And when I think about the power of ritual, it is constrictive, not in the sense of preventing expansion, but almost like a skeleton or an armature or a way of providing a framework that, admittedly, not in all moments, and anything can fall into rote. Human beings are great at turning everything into that. We have a very high capacity for autopilot, but it allows for those possibilities, and it provides us with a kind of orientation that allows for that. So I think the constancy of it is actually really important. The fact that I'm committed to doing this thing. And I don't always love it, and I don't always feel transformed and ennobled, but ritual works on us in mysterious ways. There was a time in my life where I was committed to doing every one of the katas that I had learned every day. Some moments they were great, and sometimes they were sloppy and terrible. And both of those things can be true, sometimes on a single day and certainly on consecutive days. Religious life is never one of those things where when you hit a goal, you're done. Achat sha'alti me'et Adonai ota avakesh. One thing, the psalmist says, I have asked of you, that's what I'm asking for. And in the way that that's commonly used in Hasidic sources, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, in the name of one of his friends and teachers, quotes this, says, Achat sha'alti me'et Adonai. One thing is not just one thing in a static sense, but the one more thing, the dynamic next step, what philosophers sometimes call the adjacent possible, the thing that's just over the horizon that you can actually get to. It's not 400 horizons over. Ota avakesh, that is the thing that I am always questing for. And so rather than resting on one's laurels and rather than giving up, one makes peace with this fact that, yeah, there are going to be hard moments and moments of feeling stuck. But the other example that's often given is the ascent of a spiral staircase. Half the time you're in the dark and you have no idea where you're going. It's like the switchbacks on a mountain where half the time you feel like you're going this way and half the time you feel like you're going that way. And this way has a great view. And that way you can't see anything except the trees, which are beautiful in a different way. But it's these moments of going out and in which go back to this ratzo v'shov, the kind of peregrinations or the movements back and forth, which I guess defines us as dynamic spiritual beings. So how does this happen? Commitment, openness, humility, optimism, possibility, embodiment, spontaneity, obligation. Yeah. Yes, please.
You spend some time in your book speaking about the how and the why of the body. I mean, you began earlier by saying how scholars of religion studied religious individuals as disembodied minds. What role is the body playing in your research and in the Hasidic practice that you're researching?
There are some rituals which can be internal. You can create contemplative pathways that lead you through the inner mansions and the dimensions of one's soul. All those things are true. Ritual, more often than not, and I would say by far more often than not, is not undertaken at the expense of the body, but through the body. And I think one of the great lessons that Hasidism really puts onto the table of spiritual ideas is that the body is not something to be afraid of. And the body is not something to be either fasted and trained through asceticism in a destructive sense, nor is it something to be ignored, but something that is meant to be uplifted and transformed, perhaps yoked, like in the yogic sense, in which we bring the body along and thereby allow ourselves to do other kinds of work in this spiritual sense. And in Hasidism, the dance and the song and the community and the eating and all of these things that receive a spiritual orientation are all acts that require us to remember that we are spiritual beings, embodied, and that is not something that is pulling at each other. We're not simply a soul waiting to return to its maker, but rather that the soul, as it's crystallized within this body, just as it's in this world, has particular work to do, and it can only do it in this particular body. Bodies come in many different shapes and sizes. Bodies come with many different abilities and ranges of abilities. And I think the kind of holistic dimension of Hasidism, in which all of those are seen as part of the unfolding of the divine story, is something that I've really appreciated in Hasidism.
These embodied practices and rituals that are being developed in and by Hasidism, are they rituals that you see as relevant to people outside of the Hasidic world, outside of the Jewish world? Is there some kind of Hasidic rituals for the broader world at large, or is it rituals per se that is a concept which needs to be exported?
In terms of the development of particular rituals, Hasidism does what all great innovative movements do. On the one hand, it says, I'm not inventing anything new, I'm just adding new meaning to the rituals that have come before. On the other hand, yeah, there are definitely new rituals that evolve, and both of those things are true. Some of them are really specific in their placement within the landscape of Jewish thought, theology, and living. On the other hand, the notion of, let's take Shabbat as a day of rest, a day in which not only are you desisting from digital activities or mundane concerns, which have their place, as we just spoke about, but a day of spiritual connectivity in which one's language is transformed, in which one's ways of being are transformed. I can think of perhaps no greater lesson for a world in which, I don't think the graven images are false divine anymore. It's productivity. It's the instrumentalization of other human beings and those other things which I would say become the idols of our day. That's a message that I hope that, in particular, Hasidism can offer to people. Dance, song, storytelling, things that take on incredibly rich spiritual dimensions and fit within the tapestry of Hasidic ritual, I think are absolutely central to how human beings make sense of their lives and make meaning of their lives, and also pass that on to others. The notion that reading and text study is not just cerebral but also embodied, and that we can expand our own minds and hearts through careful training and attunement, through encountering the works of the ancients. Seneca says this, not a great Hasidic thinker, but a great thinker. The philosopher, the Roman Stoic Seneca, says that it is in the study of philosophy that we annex every age to our own. And in a world in which everything's got to always be new and everything is about efficiency, the way that Hasidism approaches texts and community, and text in community, and community as seen through text, and both of those things, I think is an enormous lesson, especially for a culture in which third spaces are few and far between, that are not work and not the home. That's another. Hasidism has a great world of material culture. In my other life, I work also as an educator for Atik, the Jewish Maker Institute, run by my wife and life partner in every way. And part of the central message of her work there is that the kind of textured, multi-sensory approach to education and to religious life that you find in Hasidism means that another false polarity, text study and art, can't have both. How can you not have both? They both come together. How can you know anything about yourself if you're not working with your hands? How can you know an idea without expressing it in art, and vice versa? That's something that I would love to see continue to grow, and not only in Jewish educational spheres, but in religious educational spheres, and in any place where young people are being told this is what life can be. I think that this is another great contribution that Hasidism makes. And then I would say, you've pushed, and I think rightly so, for thinking about the how, but I will push back, and I hope also rightly so, for thinking about the why. And the how is also a matter of, does it matter what you're doing? At the end of the day? Yeah, it does, but it also matters how. And I think one of the great gaping holes in 20th century philosophy is that early 20th century philosophers and also mid-century philosophers said the why matters more than how it impacts other people, and the social dimension doesn't matter. And I think all of that is as morally bankrupt as philosophy can get. The how matters, the impact matters, but also the why, to what end, matters. And ultimately, the fact that Hasidism's great spiritual message is that there are no moments that are impossible to transform. And there are no moments that are so ordinary that they can't be uplifted. And rather than seeing that as some kind of magical process, Hasidism begs for us to bring the human capacity for attunement, for resonance, and for presence to everything that we do. So in that sense, we radiate those virtues outward through our good work in the world, and we are asked to be agents and archons of compassion. And it is in that sense that I think the ritual life of Hasidism radiates through many different modes of human being in the world, to use an old Kabbalistic metaphor, like the way that light permeates a stained glass window. It's the same light, and it comes through many different ways that humans are in the world.
I'm really appreciating the way in which there's an expansive knowledge that you have about the rich and complex and multivocal treasure that is Hasidism, and the ability to really bring out the gems and insights and lights that are so relevant to today's day and age is really, it's exquisite to witness and to experience with you, and the kindness that you speak about is something which I've seen you embody as well. There's an underlying assumption in a lot of this conversation, and maybe we'll, depending on how your time is shaping up, maybe this will be the last question or last subject. The assumption, Hasidism you've identified, and most scholars do, not all, but most scholars do, as a mystical movement. I'm a big fan of mysticism. It's a large subject here at the channel, but mysticism is one of those terms that also, as you mentioned, carries a lot of misnomers and baggage in today's day and age. I'd love to challenge you to make a case for mysticism, why it's relevant in the 21st century, why it's relevant today, and what are the new horizons that we are not quite there yet, that it gives us the push to imagine and the moral courage to dream of. Because I think that when a lot of people think of mysticism, they think just about things that are unrigorous and unscientific and boogeymans of the imagination. But what really is the real mantle of mysticism, both expressed through Chasidism and also larger historically and in your own life?
Yeah, for many people, mysticism is fuzzy thinking, and a kind of yearning for the transcendent at the expense of this world. In my class on comparative mysticism, we often begin with looking at historical definitions of mysticism in the English language mostly, pretty much without fail over the past 3 to 4 centuries. Pretty much without fail, they are all polemic. And if you expand the lens to other languages, it's not necessarily that different. The people who define mysticism tend to be its antagonists. And I think, they're not wrong in thinking that the mystical definitions offered by William James or Evelyn Underhill or Rudolf Otto or many of the great sort of theorists of mysticism in the late 19th and early 20th century leave something to be desired. On the other hand, those writers speak with such great power about the power of human spirituality that there's something really important to bring from them. And I'll come to a definition here soon, which is that, every form of mysticism is specific in its own religious traditions, to say that there are not common cultural types or shared vocabularies or modes of thinking and acting and reasoning and questing across different religious traditions, is just an abject denial of, with all due attention to difference, to true commonalities that one finds across religious traditions. And also things that are not classically defined as religion, whether that's nature writing or whatever it might be. So I am often drawn to a definition of mysticism that kind of yes ands rather than says no, 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 and says that what they said I think is really important, and let's think about what that might mean in the 21st century. So first and foremost, rather than an insular body or doctrine that's cut off either from the religious traditions or from time and space, it's something that has to be contextualized and understood within its particulars. I'm often drawn to mysticism as a process rather than as a sort of static idea, and a process that can include a great variety of different cultural elements. So I often borrow a term from Anthony Mara's wonderful novel and describe mysticism as a constellation or a cluster of vital phenomena, all of which point toward a yearning for intensified and intense religious life, a commitment to certain kinds of practice, and a yearning to move beyond that which is seen externally as the sole definition of meaning or existence. And it's something that holds together writing, but also ritual, and also human actions, and a great variety of religious experiences. And in that sense, I often find myself drawn back to the ancient definitions of mysticism as related to mystery, and to perhaps its earliest uses, in which mysticism or mystikos is seen as the closing of one's eyes. But rather than the closing of one's eyes and the denial of the world, I see it as the closing of one's eyes to one's initial perception, to one's assumptions, and the willingness to open those inner eyes, which are also outer eyes, and to seeing that the world as it is not the world as it must be. And that we can imagine different futures, and that sometimes those futures are also manifest in our present. What does this have to contribute to our way of thinking? I think that education in a mystical key would look very different than education as it commonly looks. I think that in a time of mental health crises, which are multifactorial, which have everything to do with loneliness and lack of community, to stresses and anxieties, which are new, towards social media and all sorts of other things, a reminder of the centrality of the social obligations and the social power of mysticism is a really important corrective, together with the contemplative dimensions. I do a lot of work with an organization called the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society, where we really think about, like, what are the lessons that Jewish mysticism has to bring to different arenas of knowledge and action, and how can it contribute toward a better and more verdant future, to use that common phrase. And education is one of those, mental health is another, ecology we'll come to in just a second. A pretty metastatic problem in America is mass incarceration and the rampant social inequality that both leads to it and compounds it. And if we saw human society as not based in political or identity concerns, but rather a kind of substratum of unification or unity that unites all of us within a common bond of life? Could we have the kind of society that we have today? I don't think so. And that's, again, an identity that's not built on the way that identity politics works, which has its place and its importances, but it goes so much deeper than that, in which allyship is fundamental to the human condition, and in which we then, of necessity, have to show up for each other because of our mutual concerns. That then feeds directly into our work in spiritual ecology, which is in a world in which the planet is imagined as inert and as ready for extraction. It's no wonder that we've led ourselves into this situation. What if the world is filled with divinity? What if the animals produce voices of God? What if we are part of a communion of subjects, to use Barry's beautiful phrase? What if we took the lesson of the Baal Shem Tov seriously, of Maloch ha'aretz kvodo, that the world is filled with divine presence? How might that fundamentally reorient not only on a philosophical sense, but also our policy decisions, our regulation decisions, our regulatory decisions, and our economic decisions? It's a totally different way of closing one's eyes to those and opening one's eyes to different possibilities.
It's an exquisite pleasure to join you in conversation and in friendship on the edge of the horizon of new possibilities. And I'm almost wanting to ask, is there a horizon that I'm missing in the conversation? Is there something beyond? There's a real sense where I'm limited by my possibilities of imagination, and I see a real creativity to see beyond in many spheres. Is there a question that I'm not asking that you're wanting to hear?
I think if I gave you the question, it wouldn't be yours. And I think one of the things that I love about mysticism and discussions of mysticism is that when they go awry or when they're done in impoverished ways, all they are about is about very specific concerns. But if mysticism is thought about correctly and it's thought about deeply, then the conversation and the implications of mysticism stretch toward every element of what it means to be a human being in this world, within this more than human world, within this project that we are a part of. And so, in that sense, I think the conversation has gone to all of the right places, and were we to finish it, were it to feel wrapped up with a bow, were it to feel complete, then I would have misgivings about whether or not we had done the work we set out to do.
Certainly. We began the conversation with a ritual. I don't know if it was on camera or if it was pre-camera. Is there any end of conversation ritual that feels appropriate?
I always tell my students that one of the lessons that I took from martial arts is that every encounter and any moment of shared work begins and ends with respect and with gratitude. In martial arts, that's the form of the bow. In any other way that one shows respect and gratitude, I think it's correct. So I think I'll just say, thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for your time and attention. I think the world would be a different place if we remembered that every encounter begins and ends with gratitude and respect.
Truly. Thank you for joining me. It's been a great pleasure to join you in conversation and to spend some beautiful quality time together. And despite the many obligations that you have taken upon yourself to try and envision new possibilities in this world, in thought, in text, in family, in institutional work, making the time here to share that research and that wisdom and that presence with me is very much appreciated, and I'm no doubt appreciated on behalf of the whole community that's joining us here.
Thank you. This is not icing on the cake. This is core to the work. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm grateful for your time and attention.
Thank you.
L'chaim.
L'chaim.